I think I sent Dakota the thing I wrote about my grandfather. I never knew him. He was dead before I was born.
Mm.
But he was as big as life in our family.
And why did your grandparents move to the Native American reservation?
Well, it's a long story. My grandfather went out after he graduated from college. He and a friend decided they wanted to go west. That was when everybody was excited. Go west, young man, Horace Greeley. So they looked in newspapers and found ads for people to herd sheep. So they decided they would do that, and they had a perfectly awful experience. They had heavy snows, and the market fell for sheep, and so the owner of the sheep wouldn't even buy hay so they could feed the sheep. And they lost much of the herd, and the rest of them were not any good for sale, so the man wouldn't pay them for all their work. I don't know whether it was because he didn't want to go back empty-handed or he just wanted to explore, but he ended up driving bulls from one place to another and taking a job here and there. He ended up in Seattle at one point before he went back. But he loved the West. And when he went back to Kentucky, he became editor of the newspaper. Because he had been out west and knew something about it, he was asked by these Kentucky businessmen who had a license to trade with the Indians if he would go out to this trading post in Utah to try to figure out what was going wrong, because it was losing money and they didn't like that. So Granddad and the young man went out and sort of got the trading post back on its feet. He smoked like a chimney, I'm sure, just like my dad did. Yeah. But that was before they were willing to believe that cigarettes had anything to do with lung problems. And he was having a lot of problems, and the doctor said, "You've got to get to a drier climate." And he was thrilled. So he went home and said they needed to move to Utah. Because he had been editor of this newspaper, he got a job on the Salt Lake Tribune. And that was the opposition newspaper, opposition to the Mormon newspaper. It was struggling because no Mormon business would buy ads in it. And they had to pay people in scrip, which could only be traded with non-Mormon businesses.
Oh, boy.
And about that time, my grandmother's brother had been set up as the manager of another trading post. He had been sent there because he was a gambler that gambled on the horses, and they thought being there isolated, he would get over this habit. Nobody realized that the Indians gamble more than almost anybody. And so he was losing money. So my grandfather and grandmother went out to check on that trading post and then decided the only thing to do was to buy the trading license and run it himself. And so they moved there, and actually one would think it would be going into greater isolation. But because it was a town that was built up around the Indian agency, so all of it was government employees, none of them were Mormons. And so they finally had people around them who would accept them, and they were comfortable.
How was it growing up on the reservation?
It was what childhood was. You don't compare it to other things because that's all you know. I mean, it was isolating. The school was 7 miles away, and the kids were scattered all over. I mean, you couldn't walk to the nearest neighbors.
Oh, so you didn't socially integrate with the other people on the reservation?
The Indians and the white people were kept quite, I mean, I shouldn't say were kept quite separate. There were certainly no rules about it, except that the Indian children went to the Indian school, and we went to the public schools.
Did they have their native language in that? In their school?
No, at that time, my dad got very upset. He would talk at length about how badly the Indians were treated. The attitude of the federal government toward the Indians changed with each administration. At that point, the idea was they would send them to these Indian schools, make them speak only English, and get the basic skills so that then they could go on into the white schools. I think a lot of damage was done in terms of the culture and everything else through that. We would run with the little Indian kids, who came into the store, into the trading post. But my mother was terrified of our getting tuberculosis because it was rampant on the reservation. So she really limited the amount of time we spent around the Indian children. The most contact my brother and I had we would get paid 2 cents a bottle for pop bottles that we collected because Dad had to pay for them, and he didn't charge the Indians for them. There was a big gambling ground where the Indians would gather during the day and sit there, and they played cards. We would go down with our wagon and gather up pop bottles there and visit with the Indians. We always felt very safe around them. I mean, I think I grew up feeling different, but also never feeling threatened at all. My parents' best friends, it was a Indian man and a white woman. But he was not a Ute. He was from some other reservation. He worked at the school. My mother's youngest brother married an Indian woman.
Was that weird to have mixed marriages like that?
My Kentucky grandmother certainly did not approve of that. We had big family dinners, but she never invited Uncle Larry and Aunt Margaret. She strongly disapproved. And from what I've heard, my grandfather would not have. He was far more accepting. Mm-hmm. My grandmother did not want my father to marry my mother because I think in her eyes my mother was sort of white trash because she had a divorced mother and not much education. But they became very close over the years, so it worked out all right.
Unfortunately, I don't know the names of these people. They're Indian pictures taken somewhere between probably 1900 and 1910. Possibly some were taken a little before that. Now I know this picture I can talk about. My grandfather was the first white man who was permitted to take pictures of the Sundance. And this is a Plains Indians dance. The Utes were Plains Indians. Now that one is a little boy, I don't remember his name, but he was near my dad's age, I think. Now that one I do know, he's Tim Johnson. And I don't think that I knew him as a child, but I heard the family name him. One of the troubles is that the Indians had names that changed all their life depending on what they did, and the government insisted on giving them names when they created the government rolls. So Tim Johnson was probably not his name. Now, this person we know is Allison Pigeon. Now, this man was still alive when I was a child, and I remember him. and his name is Andrew Perank.
They all have anglicized names.
That's what I'm saying. Then when the government took down names, they gave them English names. This little boy was named for my father. Bobby Sapanese was Bobby as a baby. I'm sure that I saw him. I'm not sure I would remember. These, I think, are just really handsome people. Now, this crazy Indian was still around when I was a child. He probably had syphilis, and there was quite a bit of syphilis there. There was one woman, her name was Charlotte. We kids were afraid of her, but she was probably totally harmless. But she was hugely heavy and immobile. She would come into the store and sit there all day just to keep warm. The trading post was warm, so a lot in the winter people just came in. But she used to come in and buy a loaf of bread and a pound of lard and spread the lard on the bread and eat it. And when it came time to close the store at night, Dad would ask her to leave and she wouldn't leave. And the only way he could get her out of there was to send someone for her husband. And he would come on and say, "It's time to go home now." She would get up and go home with him. And she once walked in on me when I was sick. I was home alone. His mother was overworking in the trading post, and I heard the door open and shut, and I thought it was my brother coming home from school. And I looked up, and here was Charlotte looking down on my bed. And it scared me to death. And I just lay there as still as I could, and she looked probably no more than 30 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. And she left, walked on through the house, went out the kitchen door. And that actually made me unafraid of her after that, because I knew she was curious and not much more. Somewhere there is a picture of Nellie when she was young. Oh, there she is. That's Nellie. She befriended my grandmother when my grandmother went there. I think she recognized that my grandmother was a lonely, depressed woman. Her 4-year-old son had just died when they moved in. And my grandmother, being a Southerner, would never allow an Indian to enter the house, but they would sit out on the porch and talk. And she would bring food out to Nellie. I mean, she treated her like a friend, except you didn't cross the threshold.
That's bizarre.
Well, if you grew up in Kentucky, you would understand it.
What do you think was going through her mind when she considered this woman a friend but didn't want to let her in the house?
I'm not sure she would have used the word friend, but she appreciated her. You know, had the Indian served that purpose, she probably would have let her in the house to be a maid, to clean the house and do that sort of thing. It would have been all right. There was a kind of barrier that those of us today have a little hard time understanding. In fact, my grandmother, she had lost her son to diphtheria, and when there was an epidemic in Whiterocks, she went over and worked in the church. They made it into a hospital, and she went over and worked and nursed those babies. So she had a good heart, but she was who she was. That's my father. He was 12 years old, and Granddad gave him his first gun. He was thrilled with it. When he went back to get it, it was gone. His mother had taken it and buried it. When Granddad asked her about it, she said, "I've lost 2 children. I'm not going to lose one to a gunshot." So he didn't get to have that gun again a gun again until he was about 16. Now this is my Aunt Rose. She had been pheasant hunting.
Was that
That was
unusual
common. No,
for a
that
woman?
My grandfather was very enlightened for his age, and his daughters did everything that my dad did, almost. And this was my grandfather's collection of Indian artifacts, or part of it. And they had to sell most of that after he died to pay his hospital bills. It was the Depression.
It's weird that in your home area, you were some of the only white people, and then at school you were the only non-Mormon.
Yeah, yeah. I always felt a bit like a misfit no matter where I went.